is such that some word is going to be made flesh in us.
Right. Yes.
We are. There's no way around it. Some word you're going to animate a word, right? Yes. And it's just which word are you going to be animated with?
Right.
Which word is going to be made flesh in you? It isn't just that the word was made flesh in Jesus. Yes, the word was made flesh in Jesus, so we could behold it, and so that what could happen? That same word could then be made flesh in us.
Yes.
Right? And so the design of human is such that we were created to actually be able to receive a word and contain it within our heart, and then it would animate us. It would animate our thoughts. It would animate what we felt. It would animate what we do. Right?
Yeah.
And so it's just a great example of that. And I really love with musicians. You can really see with a lot of musicians when they're up on stage that the word they're singing, it's alive in them.
Yes, right.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not just something they're saying.
Yeah.
It's alive in them.
Yeah.
It's become incarnate in them. And you can see because it's a deeply moving thing for them. I think I talked about that a long time ago in a message with the lead singer of Susie and the Banshees, maybe? Susie Sue, Kiss Them For Me.
Yeah. Yeah, right? Yeah, right, yeah.
And I was just talking about that song and how that song was made flesh in her when she performed it. And we could all experience the word that was alive in her just from it animating her, right? And it's the same thing with every human being, right? And that's what's happening. A word was made alive in her.
Absolutely.
And it brought freedom and it brought healing to her heart. And then you could like experience the freedom that was being made alive in her, because that's what human is. Human will animate it, and you'll be moved by freedom. That's why we're so moved by innocence. When you see a child running around all innocent, especially adults, because we see they don't have a care in the world. Their conscience isn't corrupted. They're just la, la, la. You ever notice how that moves you?
Yes.
It's because a word is being animated in them, right? Innocence, right? And we feel we're created for innocence, right? And we could see that, and we could feel it, and we can, get happy about it.
Right. And you can see, and you can watch it in the video. That impacts the entire room, and you watch the piano player, and you know what? I'll share the link to the I'll share the link on the Facebook page.
That'd be the easiest.
And that's the easiest way to get it. So
is that to the whole movie or just to the sound?
Just to that clip that I tried to show that the sound was
Is the movie on Netflix?
The movie's on. It is in theaters now.
Oh, in theaters now.
Yeah.
And guys, real quick before we get started, we're trying to get. We use YouTube for the primary way that we get the messages out. And YouTube is just implemented a policy where they're going to restrict the tools that you can use when uploading your videos. And the metric they're using is 1,000 subscribers. So we need like 38 more subscribers to reach 1,000. So if you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube channel, Gospel Revolution Church, and you have a YouTube account, man, it'd be a great help to us if you could just go and subscribe. And that'd be great. You don't have to. If our message doesn't bless you, don't subscribe. But if the message blesses you and you have a YouTube account, just type in Gospel Revolution Church and go to the page and subscribe.
Yeah.
You don't have an account, make one.
Right, exactly. You don't have an account, make one, right? And if you only want to watch one video and then not have it be active anymore, that's true. I think I probably have like 10 or 12 subscriptions that I've watched 1 or 2 videos and then they're just there. So, and that's okay. There's no problem with that. So, what should we talk about tonight? We still got people coming in the door. John and Dawn, welcome.
Hi, guys.
How are you? Good to see you. Welcome to see you. We're glad you're here.
Hey, Billy and Jill, can you hear us now? Are you okay? You good? All right. So I don't need to worry about that little message you sent me. No. Okay. Got it. Good. And there's the beautiful Dawn Warner. Hi, Dawn. It's glad to see you back.
Good to see you, Dawn.
Good. So.
Oh, I forgot to print up the notes.
That's all right. If anybody wants them, I'll share mine. Anybody have any thoughts about here? You need notes?
No. I can do it on my phone.
The message. Did it kind of just blow you away the way it blew me away? The completely different view of Deuteronomy.
The last 10 minutes or so, that was amazing to me. that last maybe 15
Yeah, which is going to be the
minutes
kick.
or
It's
so.
the kickoff for Sunday.
Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah, I think the title of the message on Sunday will be The Great Commandment.
Okay, cool.
And then we'll crack open what that is, what it's about, what it means. And I kind of touched on this, but we think of love being the fulfillment of the law.
Mhm.
We think that means in me loving, I'm fulfilling the law.
Right.
No. What that means is that the commandment is a word that come to give birth to loving people. And so love being the fulfillment of the law is that the law came
Yes.
to give birth to loving people. And so when love is born in you, it is the completion of what the word came to do.
Oh my gosh.
Right?
Wow.
So it's a bringing forth of something, not a demanding of something.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not something you're going to perform. It's something that it brings forth in you. That's why Jesus, when he gets to John 13, and he starts talking about the new commandment, right? And if you look at 1 John, he says, a new commandment I give you that isn't new at all, right?
Right.
It's the commandment that's been from the beginning. And so when Jesus starts talking about the new commandment, he starts talking about abiding in him, that he might abide in you.
Mhm.
Because we are the branches and he is the vine, and apart from him, we can't do anything. So he says, abide in me, that I can dwell in you, and then I can give birth to love in you. That's the fulfillment of the commandment. Not you loving,
Right.
but him bringing forth love in you.
Right.
That's the fulfillment of the commandment, because that's its purpose.
Mhm.
Right? And so what we would say is the law was made flesh in Jesus. Right?
Mm.
And the fulfillment of the law is the end result of what it came to do. And what did Jesus come to do? To immerse you in the love of God.
Yes.
And so that's why love manifesting in you is the completion of the law.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh,
It's
that's
not the
great.
completion in the sense of, well, if I'm loving, then I'm doing everything right.
Yeah.
No. It's the completion in the sense of the law came to do something to you. And what did it come to do to you? It came to give birth to love in you.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Not by telling you should love, but by giving birth to love in you apart from your works
Mhm.
or your doing
Mhm.
or your self-effort.
Mhm.
And so when that love is born in you, then the law has had its perfect work. And I know so long we thought of the law in the carnal sense, and we
Yeah,
only
right.
thought of legalism,
Mhm.
but the whole Bible talks about the great lawgiver coming. It talks about the law shall restore your soul. It talks about all those things. It ain't talking about carnal ordinances when it says that. It's talking about Jesus.
Mhm.
The bottom line is Jesus is the law of God, right? Now, we were carnal, sold under sin, and so we dwelled in the shadows of the carnal mind. And so when we looked on the law in the Old Testament, all we thought of is works in which we're supposed to do, right? But that's not what the law ever said. That's not what the law was ever talking about. The law was actually talking about something where you could see it, and it would cause you to stand still and watch God bring salvation to you.
Yes.
Where you had been seeing that you were trying to bring salvation to yourself and you couldn't do it, and then you would behold this law, which is a teaching and instruction, and what you saw there would cause you to stand still and watch God and his work to bring salvation to you. And I don't just mean like I go to heaven one day.
Yeah.
I mean like he's gonna save me from the works of the flesh that are manifesting in my life. He's gonna save me from fear. He's gonna save my soul from being subverted. He's gonna come and he's gonna bring forth peace and love and joy and kindness inside of me.
Right.
He's gonna perfect love in my heart.
Yes.
And the law is gonna do something to me that shows me the wondrous work of God to do all of that apart from me and my works, to the degree that I just stand still and see what he's done. Now, doesn't that sound like what happened in Jesus?
Yes.
Weren't we all our days laboring, toiling, trying to give ourselves life,
Mhm.
trying to save ourselves from death, trying to clothe ourselves, trying to save our souls from being subverted?
Yep.
Well, the great lawgiver came. And the whole Old Testament prophesied about the great lawgiver coming and standing on a mount and delivering the law of God from that mount. Jesus did that when he gave the Sermon on the Mount. And what was the law that Jesus gave on the Sermon on the Mount? Blessed are those who see that they can't give themselves life and save themselves from death. Blessed are those who cry out to God. Blessed are those who see the righteousness of God to clothe upon them, free from their works.
Mm-hmm.
That's why Jesus said, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. So when Jesus was talking about turn the other cheek and all that, he's talking about the way God would be righteous towards us. And so he was the manifestation of the great lawgiver that the whole Old Testament talked about. And when he stood on the mount giving the law of God, it wasn't you need to do this and you need to do that. It says, blessed are those that see they have an inability to find life by their works. Yeah. Blessed are those that when they see they have an inability to clothe upon themselves with life, they cry out, Abba. Blessed are those that mourn. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are those that see God is full of mercy towards them. See, he's giving the law as it actually is. Mm-hmm. Because we thought about the law was, well, I got to go outside and cut some ears of corn, and I got to bring the corn to the temple, and, I got to offer the corn to the priest, and the priest has got to give it to God. That way I can have some more corn later. Listen, man, that ain't had nothing to do with the law, no. And so the book of Deuteronomy is all about Moses coming and God sitting with the desire. See, we scrap that from it. And we see God sits with the desire. And if you don't understand, if you don't interpret Deuteronomy from first seeing that God sits with a desire in his heart, you're going to miss it, right? Yes. Now, what is the desire in God's heart? Because it's over and over throughout 34 chapters. He desires for the children of Israel to have blessing and life and not cursing and death. That's his desire, right? So from that standpoint, he looks and he says, well, I see the only thing that can give them blessing and life is the spirit of faith. The only thing that can bring forth blessing and life in these people is me, which would be faith, which would be them resting in my ability to give it to them as a gift, right? Mm-hmm. So what he has Moses do is deliver the words, or the word. What word did he deliver them? The word of faith. Yes. So that they could behold this word of faith or this law. That's why Paul said, we gloss over these verses because we come from so much legalism and we don't even look at it. But Paul said, do we make void the law through the preaching of faith? Nay, we establish the law through the preaching of faith, he says. He's not talking about we establish thou shalt and thou shalt nots. He's saying faith is actually the law of God. The faith is actually the teaching and instruction of God. It's actually the word of God. And what is faith? Faith is the declaration of not by strength of my hand will I have life and be saved from death, but by strength of God's hand. And so that was the word Moses was teaching them, right? Because that's the only thing that can give you blessing in life and keep you from cursing and death. And we'll get into this next week, but the children of Israel had wandered in the wilderness for 40 years and they didn't enter the promised land. Right. Why didn't they enter the promised land? Because they didn't perform the works of the law?
Like I said.
Unbelief. Well, what is unbelief? Unbelief is that because they trusted in their own works and not the work of God, they didn't believe they could take the land. Right. Because they didn't think it was going to be God that gave them the land. They thought they were going to have to take the land by their own works. Right. And so when they looked at their works, they didn't believe they could take the land. Unbelief kept them from entering the promised land. So God said, listen, I see that it was unbelief that kept them out of the land. Now, when they come into the land, the children of those parents that passed away, I don't want the same thing to happen to the children that happened to the parents. I don't want the children to get into the promised land and be filled with unbelief and think that they have the promised land by their own works and not by me. And so he has Moses give these words, this teaching and instruction, the saying, the law, the commandment of God, which was, and we'll hit it next Sunday, but it's literally like 10 or 11 different times in the Bible, or in Deuteronomy, which is that it was by strength of God's hand that you entered into the promised land, not by strength and power of your own hand. Over and over in Deuteronomy it says that. By strength of God's hand do you have this goodly land. He says, I'm going to give you this teaching and instruction, this commandment, lest when you get into the promised land and you're filled with all the fatness and the goodness of the promised land, that you think it's by strength and power of your own hand.
Lest you forget.
Lest you forget that it was by me and my grace that you got all that for free, and you turn away from me as your God, and you turn towards the works of your own hands. Right? That's the whole point. That's the whole point. And so that's the law that Moses is talking about. He's not talking about commandments or any of that kind of stuff. He's talking about a teaching and instruction that when the children of Israel could see it, it would cause them to rest, where they would stand still, where they would find something in them where they would be still and know that God was God, right?
Right.
It's like if I'm sitting there and I'm looking at all the beautiful fruit in the promised land and I see all the buildings there, castles, houses, and I'm sitting there and God would come and say, and he would say, listen, remember how I took you by the hand and led you out of Egypt? Remember how it was apart from your works that I took you out of Egypt? Remember how I rained down manna from heaven? Remember how you didn't do anything to get that manna? I just gave it to you as a gift. Remember how I brought water out of the rock? Remember how I parted the Red Sea? Remember how, God would be telling them about his wondrous work to deliver them from bondage. And that would be with the intent that they would say, not by strength of my hand, O God, do I have all this fatness, but by strength of your hand. And then what that would do is that would shape their life with his faith and not their works. And then they could have blessing in life instead of cursing and death. Because Jeremiah comes in Jeremiah 17, and what does he say? Cursed is the man that doesn't perform the works of the law. Is that what he says? Does he say, cursed is the man that doesn't perform the works of the law, and blessed is the man that does perform the works of the law? I encourage everybody to go pull it up and read it. It's Jeremiah 17. It says real clearly there, cursed is the man that makes the strength of flesh their arm. Cursed is the man that trusts in the strength of the flesh. Cursed is the man that trusts in their own works. Blessed is the man whose trust and hope is in God. And then at the end of Jeremiah 17, he goes into telling them, if you'll begin observing the Sabbath, which is not taking a burden upon yourself and leaving the burden on God, you'll be blessed. And it's like, we don't want to, I don't want to say we don't want to, but it's so difficult for us to see all these passages at one time, right? We see some here, some there, and then we get off in our own thoughts without looking at the whole thing. You can't understand the book of Deuteronomy if you don't think about the whole thing at once. I mean, chapter 1 through 34. If you want to read the first 5 verses of chapter 1 and come to some conclusion, if you want to read the first 5 chapters and come to some conclusion, no. You have to factor in the whole thing. And you see, Moses and God knew that they were going to turn away from grace. Because if you look at the end, after Moses says this, and I'm going to bring this out in Jesus' picture at the end, it's going to be so beautiful. People are going to be like, oh, how did I not ever see that? But at the end, after Moses says, behold, this day I've set before you life and death, blessing and cursing, choose life. After that, God is talking. And God says to Moses, they're a froward generation. Their heart is perverse. There are children in whom didn't do the works of the law? No. They're children in whom there is no faith, it says. The whole book is about faith. The whole book is about resting in God. The whole book is about the great commandment. The great commandment. Deuteronomy is about the great commandment. The great commandment is thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy strength. That just means to believe on him for life, right? And so the commandment would be a teaching and instruction that calls you to believe on him for life, right? And so Jesus comes and says, well, the great commandment is you shall love the Lord thy God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And the second is like unto the first. You shall love your neighbor even as you love yourself. And I'm going to get into that. But Jesus isn't giving them something to perform, because he comes as the teaching and instruction that will cause people to see the wondrous works of God to give them life for free. And when they see that God has come in and conquered their death in this one man, and that he has given them eternal life as a gift, and promised them eternal life as a gift in this one man, it's going to cause them to believe on God for life and not their own works.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
You see that?
Yep. That's good.
You see how that works?
Well, with love the neighbor as yourself, Jesus was asked, who is your neighbor? And that's when Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan, which Jesus is the Good Samaritan, because Samaritans were enemies of Jews. And we were still enemies of God. He still picked us up when we were helpless and saved the death. So that's what it really just means by love your neighbor.
Yeah. It would be love your enemy. And I'll get into this, but you know what Jesus is saying there? What he's really saying there is love God. Well, how would you love God? By abiding in the testimony he's given in his son. Isn't that what Jesus said? Abide in me?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so the result of that would be what? That you would love your neighbor. If you abide in Jesus, that would bring forth love in your heart towards your neighbor. And your neighbor, even your enemy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
Because the Samaritan were the sworn enemy of the Jewish guys.
Right.
Even Joe, we were doing the Bible study, and we were talking about that passage, and Joe had to admit he can't love a Samaritan.
Wow.
As a Jewish person, you can't.
Yeah.
I said, bingo. I said, that's what Jesus was trying to tell that Jewish guy. That Jewish guy wanted, well, who is my neighbor? If I'm supposed to love my neighbor, who is my neighbor? So Jesus comes with something that he knows the guy can't do. Because the guy completely glossed over what was the great commandment, which was to abide in God for life.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
He jumps to, well, who's my neighbor? Jesus, your neighbor's the Samaritan. I mean, they're like the sworn enemies of the Samaritans.
Yeah,
they
right.
hated each other. And so Jesus picked out the guy that the Jewish guy couldn't love on his own.
Yeah.
Why did Jesus do that? Because he wanted him to observe the great commandment,
Yes.
which was to trust in God. He wanted that Jewish guy to go away and say, I can't love a Samaritan by my own works.
Right.
Bingo. That's why you're going to rest in God, and God's going to bring forth love in you, free from your self-effort. Right?
Yes. Wow.
I mean, we've
That's
mixed
good.
up our terminology so much in grace, which is, I mean, listen, we don't need to feel any shame about that. It was what it was. We're coming out of massive confusion. We're coming out of Egypt, right?
Yes.
But as we move forward, these things are going to be straightened out, right? To where we can see what was actually going on. God only ever spoke life.
Yeah.
He only ever spoke spirit.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Well, didn't Jesus say that he was spirit and he was life?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That means God was only ever speaking what we see in Jesus.
Yeah.
So it isn't that God was saying something different in the Old Testament.
Right.
He was saying the same thing, but we couldn't see it because we were living in the shadows of the carnal mind. And so when we looked upon the law of God, we didn't see it as something God would do for us.
Right.
We saw it as something we got to do for God in order for him to accept us.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
Backwards.
Yes.
Backwards. The carnal mind sees everything backwards.
I love what you said on Sunday, that if we think that things were different in the Old Testament from the New Testament, it will cause great confusion in our minds.
Yep.
And that is the truth.
What'll happen is trying to understand grace. We'll see things that look different in the old and the new, and then we'll come up with doctrines that
Yes,
is
right.
actually the preaching of sin. Right? We'll look at the blessings and the curses. We'll think that's talking about the works of the law, and then what we'll do is we'll say, well, we couldn't do it, so God sent Jesus to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And now we start defining the work of Jesus
Right.
according to the flesh instead of according to the Spirit.
Right.
And now we start saying Jesus was blessed by his own works. We start saying Jesus came and performed the works of the law.
Yeah.
That would make Jesus a sinner.
Yes.
Jesus wasn't clothed upon by his good works. He wasn't clothed upon by the good fruit he brought forth.
Right.
He was clothed upon by the Father's love for him and the power of the Holy Spirit. Period.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And listen, if we're all the time preaching about the work of Jesus and we're preaching about it according to the law or the works of the law, what's going to happen there is that we're not going to hear the faith.
Right.
We're going to hear the works of the law. Right? So what we're designed to do is to hear the faith of the Son of God. What's the faith of the Son of God? It's the persuasion that dwelled in his heart that was made flesh. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we preach about the work of Jesus, and we're not talking about how he rested on the cross and didn't lift one finger to clothe himself with life, but we're talking about how he performed the works of the law, we're not preaching the faith. We're actually preaching carnality. And we're sowing carnality into people's hearts. And we're sowing idolatry into people's hearts. And we're sowing sin into people's hearts is what we're doing. Because Jesus did not approach God by climbing out Mount Sinai. He didn't perform the works of the law. He had his disciples picking corn when? On the Sabbath. He was touching lepers when? Many times. That's a violation of the law to touch a leper. Do you guys recall where Jesus left the camp and removed himself for the required amount of time that the law said? No. No. What about the woman with the issue of blood?
Yeah. Same thing.
He touched the woman with the issue of blood.
Right.
That's a violation of the works of the law. But it's not a violation of what the law really is, which is faith in God. And Jesus had faith in God.
Yes.
He didn't have faith in the strength of his flesh. He had faith in God. Right? And so that was the thing.
Yeah.
You guys see that?
Right.
I mean, I said a bunch of mouthfuls, but do you guys see that it is very important what we think about the work of Jesus. And if we come describing it after the works of the law, instead of the faith that was in his heart, we've missed it bad, real bad. And we're not going to find the same faith shaping our lives that shaped his life.
Right.
It wasn't his works that shaped his life. It was his faith.
I know when we grew up, I mean, I know I learned that he dotted every I and
crossed
every T. And he did it all. We can't, but he did. And that's such a malarkey, but people just didn't know to think it through, I guess.
Yeah.
Right.
You still think about it with the carnal mind.
Yeah.
And Jesus did dot every I and cross every T. The thing is, that didn't have anything to do with the works of the law. The thing is, that had to do with revealing the law of faith. And he did.
He did everything he was sent to do.
He was sent to take our death upon himself, and in that place of seeing that death upon him, to trust God.
Right.
That's what he was sent to do. And he did. And in that place, he was able to conquer sin and death, right? And then promise eternal life to everyone that would believe on him, right?
Yes.
And so he did do that. And so he dotted every I and crossed every T by bringing the law out of the shadows of the carnal mind and say, hey guys, it was never about thou shalt and thou shalt nots. It was always about faith in God. Right. It was always about resting in God. It was always about the work of God. What was it about in Genesis? Adam's work or God's work? Now, what was there left for Adam to do? Enter God's rest.
Yeah.
Because the work was done.
Yeah.
Okay? And so Jesus came, revealed this wondrous work God has done in order to put us to rest and cause us to turn away from our works.
Yes.
Right?
Back up a little bit, just in case anybody is interested and wants to go do further research. I take you back to March of 2015, where you did 4 sermons on faith and the faith of the Son of God. So if you want to go back and pick that up, if you want, for those online, if you want more information about that, you want to go listen to more sermons about that. There's 4 sermons. The last one on March 29th. The fact that I remember the date is because has had such a huge impact on my life, and that's the sermon on the faith of the Son of God, the Son of Man, and it's absolutely incredible.
You can post it on the site.
I can.
Which year?
15. Yeah.
It's from the website or it's in YouTube?
It's both.
Both.
Both, right? And the notes, if you want the notes, I've got actually a 2-page summary that I just excerpted out of like 8 pages of notes for that one sermon. But that's, if people want to dig deeper into that, because that was spectacular stuff that you did there.
We don't understand the faith.
The faith, right.
Like, trust will be born in our hearts, but it comes from the faith.
Yeah.
it doesn't come from us, right? We don't hear it doesn't come by us hearing we're supposed to believe and then us working it up. When you actually look at the root word of faith, it means to persuade one, right? So it actually comes to persuade us, the faith. But we've always looked at faith just as our belief.
Yes.
Instead of seeing the faith.
Right.
Paul called it obedience to his own faith. No. Obedience to the faith.
Yes.
Right? And so we misunderstand the faith and what the faith will do to us, which is bring forth the fruit of the Spirit, which is trust.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. That's awesome.
I've always thought of it as some sort of an energy source out of me that I was trying to
Yeah, right.
get it up,
Exactly.
get it
Yeah.
up to God, and
Yep.
if I could just get it going quite enough, it would be there. And I'm looking at it that it's God coming to me. Definitely.
Right.
And,
Right.
but-
Well, and it's important for us to talk about faith because when we're talking
Yeah.
about Deuteronomy, the book of faith or the book about faith,
Yeah,
we need to make sure that we're not talking about our faith.
yeah.
It's not the subject.
Now, what'll happen is if we allow ourselves to be persuaded by that faith, then it is our faith.
Yes.
But we didn't originate it.
Uh-huh.
That's why it says in Ephesians 2, what does it say? That we're saved by grace through faith.
Mhm.
And that not of ourselves, it is the gift of God. Now let's just stop right there for a second. That and not of ourselves, it is the gift of God isn't talking about the grace part, it's talking about the faith part.
Mhm.
Okay?
Mhm.
Yeah.
So the faith part there that he says, by grace are you saved through faith. Then he says, and that faith that will save you, that will bring forth grace in you,
Yes.
it's not of yourselves,
Right.
it's a gift from God. Jesus came and he is a gift from God. He is the faith, and I behold in Jesus that my sin has been forgiven.
Yes.
And then that animates me with grace. Now, did I come up with the faith that my sin was forgiven?
No.
No.
Mm-mm.
God told me. Who did he tell me through? The Lamb
Yes.
that took away the sin of the world.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
And so he says, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. The faith part is the part that's the gift from God. Then he goes into works, not of works, right?
Yes.
That part's talking about the grace part, right?
Right.
That's why he goes into, for you are God's workmanship. Well, how does God create? Through the spirit of faith, it says.
Speak the word.
God, who called forth light out of darkness through the spirit of faith. So this faith that will animate with your life from grace, it's not of yourselves, it's a gift from God. So don't look at your ability to bring forth faith, but look at the faith that came in the person of Jesus, and it will produce in you. For you are God's workmanship, and he will create you in the image of the faith that came in the person of Christ Jesus, which is the spirit of faith. That's why it says God created all things through Jesus. So in the day, he wants to bring forth a certain life in you, a life of peace and love and joy and kindness and long-suffering and meekness and all those things. And he wants to bring forth immortality in your mortal body. He's going to do it by preaching the faith.
Let me ask you a question. When you say the term the faith, is that the same as saying the faithfulness of God?
I mean, you could say no, I wouldn't say it's the same
It's
thing.
not the same. The
The
faith.
fact that God is faithful would be an aspect of the faith, right? God is faithful. That Jesus knew God was faithful.
Right.
Jesus knew it was about God's faithfulness to him, and that caused him to rest in God, right? And so Jesus didn't say, well, the Father wants me to conquer sin and death, and so the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to take on the death of everybody, and then I'm going to clothe myself with life. Did he say that? So Jesus had something in his heart that said, it's not about my faithfulness to God in the sense the carnal mind would describe it.
Right.
It's about his
Yes.
faithfulness
Yes.
to me.
Yes.
And then that will cause me to rest. And that will actually be the manifestation of me being also faithful to him. Right?
Yeah.
Because what did he want Jesus to do? He wanted Jesus to come as a human with a body that could die so that he could take on the death of the world, and he could feel the pressing in and the temptation of that death telling him he wasn't the son. And then in that place, Jesus could do something different than the first Adam did. And instead of trying to clothe himself, Jesus would say, Abba.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And that's what God wanted Jesus to do. And that's what he did. That's why it says, by the righteousness of one man. That's not talking about the works of the law, man. It's not saying by Jesus observing the Sabbath. It's not saying by Jesus performing all the works of the law, we've got access into this grace. No, man, by the righteousness of one man, by one man coming, and in spite of being clothed in death, that one man said, not by my strength, O God, but by you. And he rested, even unto his death. He laid down the life that the world could give him. He didn't lay down his eternal life.
No.
See, this, I mean, we can really get off into, I like what Bertie says. There's much to say about that.
That's right.
I could get off into gears trying to explain that. But he did. Eternal life can't die. So what life did he lay down at the cross? He laid down the life that the world could give him.
Right.
Right? Mm-hmm. He counted that life as nothing. He said that life is not actually life at all. The only life that is real life is the life I have with the Father. That's it. And so that's the righteousness of Jesus. He rested.
So the life that he had with the Father, did that die?
No.
That's the eternal life.
That's eternal life. Eternal life can't
die. It's only
die.
the earthly life that died.
Right. You perish that way. Now, watch this. When Jesus came to the earth, Jesus also had to have some way of being taught the faith.
Yes.
It says he grew in wisdom and stature.
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus would have been a Jewish boy growing up, going to all these things. Let me tell you what, and we'll get into this next Sunday, but the book of Deuteronomy was like front and center to all Jewish people. That was the thing. They recited the Shema every day. Every day. They had it written on their arms and written in their heads. Do you know what they had written in their heads? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. You know what that meant to them? You shall have no other gods other than Yahweh.
Yes. Right.
That's what that meant to them.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Then you know what else was written on their hand, the law? By strength of God's hand we were led out of Egypt, not by strength of our own hand. You know what else was on their hand? The blessings and cursings, and how you would be blessed by resting in the strength of God, and how if you trusted in other gods, you would be cursed. They had that wrapped on their arms. So Jesus, as a young Jewish boy, was inundated with that every day. Every day he would have been reading and hearing about Deuteronomy. Every day. You know what Jesus saw in Deuteronomy? He saw that God would do a work to raise him up from the death of the cross. He saw that it would be by the works of God and not by his own strength that he would overcome the death of the cross. He saw the wondrous work of God to do all that he did in leading the children of Israel out of Egypt. He saw all that as a man, right?
Yeah.
And that taught him faith. It brought forth something in him where Jesus stood still and saw the salvation of God while he hung on the cross. He stood still and saw that it would be the work of God to save him from that cross. He was still. Be still and know that I am God. Jesus saw something in Deuteronomy that brought stillness forth in him, where even as he hung on the cross dying, he was still and was knowing that God was his God.
Yeah.
Abba.
Yeah.
Do you see that?
Yeah.
Do you see all that?
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus come and he looked on Deuteronomy and he saw what Moses was talking about. And if you go, and I'm going to get into a bunch of this stuff in a great detail, but if you go look at Deuteronomy 30, right before he says, I've set before you this day good and evil, life and blood. Right before he gets into that, you know what Moses says? This word that I've given you, it's not far from you that you should have to climb up into heaven to get it. But it's near you, even in your heart and in your mouth.
Yeah. Right.
Now, does that sound like something you do or something you believe?
Something you believe.
So what did Paul say? With the heart, Paul quoted Moses and then he built on it.
Yeah.
What did he say? He said, with the heart will believe and then with the mouth will confess. So Moses says, listen, this whole word that I gave you, you're busy thinking it's about performing all these works. Listen, brother, It's not far from you that you should have to climb up into heaven or go across the sea to bring it. But it's near you, even in your heart and in your mouth. Moses is saying, this word that I just gave you, listen, man, it's not a bunch of works to perform. It's something that will cause you to believe on God. And then when that causes you to believe on God, out of your mouth will come, not by strength of my hand, O God, but by strength of your hand. Even with the heart will I believe, it will be unto my mouth confessing God, just like Jesus. And so Moses says, with the heart you will believe, and out of the mouth you will confess. Isn't that what Jesus did on the cross? Mm-hmm. He believed with the heart that he would not be saved from the death of the cross by his own works, but he'd be saved by Abba. And then that caused him to confess out of his mouth, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. He manifested Deuteronomy 30 on the cross. He manifested the thing Moses was talking about because he heard the faith of God as a boy. When he heard Deuteronomy, he heard the Spirit. See, Jesus was born of the Spirit, not a human father. Right. So when they read Deuteronomy, the Spirit was busy inside of him. Look at this. Look at that. Watch it. See, Jesus was hearing Spirit in life because he didn't have the carnal mind. Right. And so he actually heard what Deuteronomy said. Right. And he saw the Father telling him, listen, man, the flesh will bring a curse upon you. The works of your own hands can't clothe you with glory and immortality. It can't make you the heir of the world. It can't conquer the death that's entered the world. But I can. Look at what I did there. Right? And so Jesus saw that he would receive the blessing. What was the blessing? The promise of the Spirit. And so the whole book of Deuteronomy is trying to tell Jesus about how he's going to receive the promise of the Spirit. And the way he was going to receive the promise of the Spirit was by believing on God, and it would be by God's strength and not his own that he would conquer the cross and conquer the grave. And he received the blessing, and he received the life. Yeah. The promise of the Spirit he received as a man. Right. That was the only way that the Spirit could be poured out on all flesh, is if a human came and in the place of having all death rested in God. Then that human actually believed on the Spirit. Yes. And that human was in the likeness of Adam, meaning dominion, headship over the human race. Yeah. So that allowed the Holy Spirit to now be made available to all flesh, to everyone who would see the word that Jesus saw in Deuteronomy in Jesus. Jesus is our Deuteronomy. Mm. He is the preaching of faith. When we behold him, we are hearing of faith. And then what that does is it brings something forth in our heart where we see, my goodness, that guy didn't conquer his own death. That guy didn't clothe himself. That guy was clothed by God and raised from the dead by God. And all that guy did was believe in God. Now we're not left to work up belief, but we see the wondrous work that God did for us in Jesus. That causes something to happen in our hearts where we confess out of our mouth, not by strength of my hand, oh God, but by you and your grace. Mm. And that's how in every area of your life, every area of our life where we think we see some corruptness, we're being tempted to think about how we're going to bring salvation to ourselves. Right. Every area, man. And God has come and said something in Jesus. Listen, man, I will save you from that. Right?
Greg, it so reminds me of your t-shirt with the superheroes.
Yes. Yes. And that's how I saved the world.
That's right.
You have all this, you got Batman and Superman and all those guys sweating it out, trying to save the world. And Jesus is sitting there, listen, guys, I saved the world. That's right. Let me tell you how I did it. You guys are flying here, flying there. You got all your apparatuses. You know what I did? I didn't do anything.
That's right.
I didn't lift one finger. I cried out to Abba. And Abba come and saved me.
Isn't that cool?
That's very cool.
You know, when Ezra led the captives back from captivity and they started the rebuilding of the temple, the one thing they found in the rubble was the book of Deuteronomy.
Yeah. And
they built everything on that. That's why everything's second temple is Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
I'm just amazed, I guess is a word, to come to the understanding or come to the realization, the revelation that Jesus needed to learn to grow in wisdom and stature. That he had to have the instruction and the guidance and the teaching, but that he, because he was spirit, born of the Spirit, saw it completely different than everybody else did. But he still needed to have that as he grew, as a
And then
young
he
boy.
needed to trust his
Right.
father.
Because I always thought, I just kind of said, well, he was God. I mean, he was man, but he was God. He just had it. It was automatically there, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
I mean, it was in
The
a sense.
Spirit was there.
Yeah, the
And
Spirit
the
was there.
Spirit is bringing forth faith
Yes.
in his
Right,
heart,
exactly.
right?
Exactly.
So he would hear the instruction of God. See, God found himself in a place where we were all walking in the valley of the shadow of death. Well, do you know what happens to your thoughts when you're walking in the valley of the shadow of death? It darkens your thoughts with the carnal mind.
You bet.
And you can't trust God from the carnal mind. And so God sat in a place where even if he could find a human that actually wanted to trust in him, they wouldn't be able to, because they weren't indwelled by the Spirit. And so they didn't have the thing they needed to put the thing together. So Jesus comes as a human in the valley of the shadow of death, but he's got the Spirit of life dwelling in him, connecting everything, showing him everything, teaching him the word.
Right. And so what's even more exciting is that's happening in us.
Yeah.
Because we have the Spirit too.
Right.
And that same growing in wisdom and stature, that same revelation, that same kind of understanding is happening in us. It may not be happening as fast, but it's happening.
I like how the King James Version uses the term, he who believeth on him, because the same faith that was in Jesus is the faith that we believe upon. I mean, we do believe in Jesus, but we also believe on Jesus. And that is communicating the thing that he believed in, we also believe in. And the thing that raised him from the dead is the same thing that is going to raise us from the dead.
Amen.
Because we trust in the Father just as he did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's how the whole deal works. And so it's like we needed an interpreter because God was talking spirit, but we were carnal. And so it'd be like a Chinese guy and a guy that speaks English.
Yeah, that's right.
Trying to talk to each other. The English guy ain't going to say anything the Chinese guy's saying, and vice versa. And so that's how it was with God and man, right? God is busy speaking spirit, and we were busy hearing through the carnal mind. That's why when Jesus was like, lest you drink my blood and eat my flesh, you have no part of me. And then he goes into what? My words are spirit and they are life. What was he saying there? He's saying, listen, I'm not talking about actually chewing my flesh and actually drinking my blood. I'm speaking about a truth there. But they were carnal, and what did they hear? What did they say? Oh, that's a hard saying.
Yes.
And then they all left, right?
Yeah.
They all left it said,
right.
because they all heard, we got to chew his flesh. So that's how it was with God and man.
Yeah.
God is talking spirit and life, and we were all the time carnal minded, and we were interpreting what he said through the carnal mind and getting it all wrong.
Right.
So we needed a human that could come that hadn't been corrupted by the carnal mind, but that was born of the Spirit, so that when he talked, they heard him.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And they could hear each other and fellowship with one another and understand one another. Right?
Yeah.
And so here comes Jesus. But I love what Marie says. We believe the same thing Jesus believes. It's just Jesus saw everything we see in him in the Old Testament. We couldn't see it there, so he made it flesh.
Right.
And now we believe it on the same thing he believed on, by believing on him.
Yeah.
What did he believe? God wouldn't suffer him to see corruption. He wouldn't leave him in the grave.
Yeah.
He believed in the love of the Father. He abided in the Father's love for him. He abided in the Father's teaching and instruction to him, that the Father wouldn't leave him in the grave, that he wouldn't suffer him to see corruption, but that he'd raise him from the dead by the strength of his hand and not the strength of Jesus' hand. Jesus believed on that. And now we believe the same thing through him.
Yeah.
Because we see God did it to him.
Right.
And now we see that's what God's going to do to us. And we see all Jesus did was believe God would do it.
Mm-hmm.
And now all we're going to do is be persuaded that's what God's going to do to us.
Yeah.
God didn't raise Jesus from the dead because he loved perfectly.
No.
I hate to break it to you guys. You can't love perfectly and have that conquer the grave.
No.
The loving perfectly was a result of him believing God would raise him from the dead.
Yeah, that's right.
Because the only way you can love people who are hating you and trying to take your life out is if you're believing in somebody else to care for your life. And so the only reason why Jesus wasn't against his enemies or hating his enemies is because he didn't think he had to preserve his own life, because he believed in God to preserve his life. And so that animated him with love. So the real thing Jesus did was rest in God. That's why I talked about you were a city on the hill.
He probably would have had a more acute understanding of the difference between his earthly life and his spiritual life as well.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say that, you know, he knew he wouldn't be taken out, right? He was able to differentiate between those two. That we struggle mightily with that one.
Yeah.
It's just because of the way that the world presses in on us. So.
Well, and you won't find many people that will come and rejoice with you about despising the life the world can give you.
No.
Listen,
No,
you won't find a lot of people that will come and want to come and have a powwow and be like, "Who cares about our life in the world?"
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
Especially in the American society, this isn't to despise America or Americans. I'm American and I love America and all that kind of stuff. But we've got it like, as far as like life goes, this is as good as anybody's ever had it in the history of mankind. And so we would struggle to come together and rejoice about not caring about the life we have in the world. You see, but when you look at the early church, they didn't have any life from the world. They were being persecuted and martyred. So there was no confusion for them, right? Mm-hmm. There's one life. There's no confusion because we're going to die.
Yeah,
and so,
that's right.
do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So they had a fellowship with that, a fellowship around this world. The life I have in this world, that's not my life. Yeah. They had the means or the fellowship by which they could. In America, you start talking like that, people are busy with the American dream. What about my dreams?
Yeah, right. The whole fitness industry would collapse.
And that's not to despise having dreams, but every one of our dreams is actually tied into only wanting peace and love and joy and kindness and long suffering and meekness. And we think these things are what will give it to us. Yes, right. And so then we dream things. Right. I find the more I walk in the word of life, the more I find that my dream has been fulfilled. Because the more I see that my heart's desire and dream was really only ever to have life. And I see that I have it in God. And so everything else is just like gravy. It doesn't come into the realm of dream or not dream. It doesn't come into the realm of me not doing something I wanted to do or I did do it. None of it doesn't factor in like that anymore. I don't look at things like that anymore. I don't look at this world and live from the place as if it can keep me from something. It can't. This world can't keep anything from a person who has the Son. This world can't prevent you from experiencing or enjoying something. So, you know, you won't find a lot of people in America that want to come around and be like, yeah, who cares about the life in this world?
It's kind of like a paradox, though, because, you know, everybody wants to have nice things, and everybody does.
Yeah, amen.
And but when you come to realize where real life comes from, that you are the possessor of that life, if good things come to you, awesome, that's great.
That's right.
But you can also look at the bad things that come into your life and say, I understand these things happen in this life, in this world that we live in. So the good things don't give you your strength, don't provide you with your strength, and the bad things can't take the strength away.
Amen.
It's a good way to be. It's a good position to be in.
Yes, it is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You don't despise it. If you're trying to live like what I'm talking about by despising the good things, you're living after the flesh. You're trying to bring it to yourself, right? You don't despise the good when it comes. You know, when the woman came with the perfume to wash Jesus's hair and his feet and everything, he didn't say, oh, well, get that away from me. He let her do it, right? So you don't despise the good thing, but what Marie said is the greatest explanation of that, right?
Very good. Very good. Wow.
Deuteronomy, man.
Deuteronomy.
It's a whole new book.
And that's the way that, I mean, you'll be amazed as we go forward and I bring out all these verses and you read them, what it says and what it talks about. And it talks about why the commandment was given. The whole point of the commandment was that they would rest in God and not their own works. That was the whole point.
Yeah.
Everything Moses said was with the intent of bringing that forth, so that when they got into the promised land, they wouldn't think they got that by their own strength. They would remember that they got it only by God, and then that they wouldn't trust in their own works, but they would trust in God, and they would find blessing in life all the days of their lives, and they would find their children living in the land and their children's lives being established, and that they wouldn't find cursing and death. Right?
So maybe you're going to touch on this next week, but and we've already mentioned that God only brings life. But many times in Deuteronomy, and in particular in Deuteronomy 28, it talks about God smiting, or God will smite you. So
Right.
is that to be interpreted in the same context as we understand God's wrath to be, in that he's basically allowing, it's like 20, 21 and follow.
Oh, 21, I think it's 28.
No, in chapter 28, but verse 21 and follow.
So here's the context of that, and this is what it's, let's see if I can pull it up. Because it tells you, and you have to wrestle with, what does this mean? It's
Right.
like, I wish I
I'm wrestling with.
I wish I could repeat what Maurice said that day. I don't know exactly how he said it, but there's the meaning of what is written there,
Yes.
and then there's what's written there.
Yes.
And those are two different things.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And so what you want to try to wrestle with God or the scriptures, if that's what you like to do, is what do these verses mean instead of what do I think they say?
Yes.
And one of the things I posted in the Bible study page, I said, let us not read the Old Testament and ask ourselves what it means, but let us read the Old Testament and think of what did Jesus see that this meant.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
Okay, but when you get to
And that was helpful.
when you get to Deuteronomy 32:20, this is what it says. This is after Moses laid it all out. God's talking, telling Moses, listen, man, they're not going to hear. All right? That's why I'm going to send this great prophet after you. It's going to be in your likeness. Look what it says in Deuteronomy 32:20. And he kind of defines the smiting. And it would be defined like faith, right? And before I read this verse, for example, and we talked about this in the men's Bible study, but like with Gideon, you know, all the Midianites were killed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did Gideon kill them?
I don't know.
No. It says that they turned their swords on one another through fear and confusion.
Okay.
What it says.
That's
and
what I
what
thought.
Gideon and then
Yeah.
went in there was an earthen vessel,
Right.
with a light inside of it and a trump. What'll happen is they'll blow the trump, and when they blew the trump, they would take the earthen vessel, take the light, smash the earthen vessel on the ground. And then the Midianites turned on each other. Right? That's a picture of Christ, right? Because the trump was a declaration of Christ.
Yes.
The earthen vessel was Christ's body being broken.
Mhm.
The light was Christ. So you have an example like that where you wrestle with the scriptures, but when you get to Deuteronomy 32:20, this is what it says. And he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end shall be, for they are a very froward generation, children in whom is no faith. Okay? So when it says that God's going to hide his face from them there, what it's basically saying there is that they're not going to partake of blessing in life because they're not going to believe on God. They're going to trust in the strength of the flesh.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
So through the whole book of Deuteronomy, what does it say will bring cursing and death? God or trusting in your works?
Trusting in your works.
Okay, so who does the smiting?
Trusting in your works.
Right.
Yes.
So remember when we talked about Exodus and the judgment?
Yes. Right.
What was God's
Yeah, yeah.
judgment
Yeah.
against the gods? He judged against Egypt's gods as
Right.
being able to provide life,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Talks about them being smitten
Mhm.
by the judgment of God, right?
Yes.
Well, what was the judgment of God? That those gods you're believing in can't give you life. So what actually smote them? The gods
The
they
belief.
believed in?
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah. The belief.
exactly.
Okay.
So when he talks about God smiting in context of the blessing and the cursing, what it's saying there is that God has issued a judgment
Mm-hmm.
that trusting in the works of your own hands for life will not give you life. It will give you death and cursing. Okay?
Right.
And if they believe on other gods, then that's going to serve them with death.
Yeah.
That's them being smitten by God.
Okay.
Right?
Yep. Good. That makes complete sense. I kind of had a sense that it was going to be similar to the way we have worked through the definition of God's wrath and what that means. So that makes sense. Thank you.
It's God. It's God basically. He can't keep them from doing what they want to do.
Right.
And so it's basically God saying, listen, I've come to tell you the way into life, and I've also told you this other way, what it will do to you, right?
Yeah.
He can't keep them from doing what they want to do.
Right.
And at some point, he's gonna have to let them loose to do what they want.
Right.
Not let them loose angry at them punitively, angry that they're gonna perish.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
And then what'll happen is it's kind of like, what? I'm sure when my parents were trying to tell me that drugs would kill me and I wouldn't listen and I kept doing the drugs, I'm sure there were times when my parents were like, what's the word it says in the Bible? Disbelief, right? It's like a frustration that comes from disbelief. Like God can't believe that here he wants to give them life as a free gift, but they want to trust in their own works.
Right.
Even after he showed them that their works will give them death.
Right.
They still go to their works, right? He can't keep them from it. So at some point, he lets them have what it is they want. Now, when he lets them have what it is they want, what's going to happen? Death. Why? Because the wages of God smiting them is death.
No.
The wages of
the
sin is death.
Yeah.
Right. Does that make sense?
Totally.
So when
Thank you.
Moses came off the mountain with the 10 Commandments, if they all would have just went, I can't do this, they would have been in good shape, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And when you go study this out, there's a lot of things you can study this out. I've preached this a lot over the last 7 years. People missed it because they're probably like, what is that guy talking about? Because they're still trying to know law, grace, law, grace,
Yeah,
law,
right.
grace.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But if you go and look and you study this out, and you look into Jewish culture, the law given from Mount Sinai was written on sapphire stone.
Mm-hmm.
Sapphire stone is a blue stone. Mm-hmm. The throne of grace is described as made with sapphire stone.
Yes, right.
So when Moses went up to meet with God, he was standing on grace ground, holy ground. Mm-hmm. That's why he said, take off your shoes, Moses. You're standing on grace ground. You're standing on ground that's been set apart through the Spirit of grace. That ground was sapphire stone. That's why the law that he had written on stones was actually written on sapphire stones. So it was actually trying to communicate grace. That's why it says the law was a shadow. Because there was a shadow of grace there, but we couldn't see it clearly. And if you go read Numbers 15, remember the account of the guy that got stoned because he picked up sticks? Remember that account?
No.
Go read Numbers 15. The guy that picked up sticks got stoned. He picked up sticks on the Sabbath.
On the Sabbath, okay.
It talks about the presumptuous sin and the sins of ignorance. The presumptuous sin is talking about the unforgivable sin, which is to reject the Spirit of grace.
Yes.
Right? Unforgivable just means that God can't send death away from you if you reject the Spirit of grace, because it's the Spirit of grace that conquers your death.
Right.
And so if you reject the Spirit that conquers death, he can't send death away from you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So if you go look in Numbers 15, after that guy gets stoned, God tells Moses to take a blue thread and stick it in the four corners of their hemline, their garment, to remind them of the law. What law? To rest in God, because it was the Sabbath that guy had violated. And so all throughout the whole Old Testament, everything God was teaching them was about resting in grace. Everything. He didn't change. Everything was about resting in grace. When he let them out of Egypt, did they have the works of the law? No. When he gave them the Feast of Unleavened Bread, did it have something to do with performing the works of the law? Did it have something to do with not mixing works and grace? Right. You didn't mix in yeast, because that's what man added to the bread to make the bread rise.
Exactly.
And so you weren't going to add your works to the bread, and you were going to leave it be. That was to teach you, you're not going to mix your strength with God's strength. Right?
That's right.
It's God that led you out of Egypt. You didn't help him.
Right.
You didn't help him out there. So the whole Old Testament is talking about this the whole time. The whole time it's talking about grace, 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 grace. God can only talk grace. He can't talk carnality.
Yeah.
It's like we think God come talking carnal.
Yeah. Just like.
What was that? It was Numbers 15.
15. Yeah, it's the account where the guy picks up sticks on the Sabbath. and then he's stoned. And we talked about this in the men's Bible study, but the reason why the guy would be stoned, that's the way he was put to death, is because the stones represent a heart that was hardened to God's grace.
Yeah.
And so he wasn't resting in God for life. Well, the wages of rejecting the Spirit of grace is death. Yeah. And so he was put to death, not because God wanted him to die, but because God was showing them, listen, man, you're believing in something that's killing you. So after that guy dies, because he didn't observe the Sabbath, which means to what? Rest from your works.
Right.
God says, Moses, tell them to put a little blue thread, blue, the color for what?
Grace.
Grace.
Mm-hmm.
Put a little blue thread in the corner of their hem garment so they all the time see that blue thread. And that blue thread all the time reminds them of what? To enter God's rest, which is what the Sabbath was talking about. Now, does that sound like he's talking like works of the law there? No. He's talking about resting in grace. Right? And so they were all the time talking about this.
Wow.
I'm gonna go back and read that one.
Yeah, it's good. You can get a lot of stuff there, but when I first understood I wasn't under the works of the law, my whole theology was very dualistic. And I thought the old and the new were completely different. I didn't see that they were the same, but one was a mystery. It's a shadow, right? Yeah. We're like, if I'm standing there, but my shadow's over there, we're the same thing, aren't we?
Yes.
You just can't make out my dimensions real clear.
The details.
But the shadow isn't different than me. In fact, they're the same thing. And so the law was a shadow. So it was the same thing of the good things that came. It wasn't a different thing. It was the same thing. Yeah. But we didn't see what it was until the Word was made flesh. Right? And so everything that God was ever trying to do was trying to influence man to enter his rest. All the time. All the time. And why did he do that? Because he knew that if our life was shaped by our own works, it would serve us with death and cursing. Yeah. And he's trying to save us from death and cursing over and over and over and over and over and over and over again.
That none should perish.
That none should perish.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
That's what God was always doing.
Right.
He was always doing that.
And Satan has been so effective in painting a picture to the contrary about God.
Yeah. Well, that's what he wants.
Yeah. Totally.
And death does that.
Yeah.
I talked about this a little bit in the pre-message, which, man, I didn't realize how long that went on. I almost had to scrap the message because that went on for so long. But
that was okay.
Yeah, it was.
Death isn't life. Okay?
Yeah.
All right, well, once the knowledge of good and evil entered the earth, we had a knowledge of good and evil. And we saw death, and we said death is evil. And we saw God, and we saw God had life and light, and he didn't have any death, and we said that's good. Well, then we didn't see light and life in ourselves. We saw death.
Right.
And so then we concluded we were evil. So we judged ourselves through the eyes of death.
Yes.
Then we also judged God's heart through the eyes of death. We sat with the knowledge of good and evil. We said God must live by that also. And so God must look at us in our body of death and have rejected us and left us as orphans in the earth. Therefore, we got to give ourselves life.
Yeah.
That's what Adam did, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And so everything God was doing after that was trying to bring forth faith in our hearts towards him, where something could be born in us, where we would stand still and see the salvation of God. I mean, what were they all doing when the children of Israel? Think about when they got to the Red Sea, and the sea's there, and all the Egyptians are coming.
Right? Yeah.
What are we going to do? I mean, listen, you're really being rude to think we got to do something. And what does Moses say? Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord.
Yes.
Isn't that what he says?
Exactly.
Wasn't that the work of God? Didn't they need a work to be done?
Yeah.
Didn't that tell them not by their works, but by the work of God? Do you see what God was doing there? Mm-hmm. And he kept doing that. The manna, the water out of the rock. That's what he was always doing. Mm-hmm. That's the only thing he can do. He can only be himself. Right. It's like we think he could be Pharaoh for a while.
Yeah.
It's like we think God come and brought us the mortar and the straw and wanted us to make bricks.
That's right. Yeah.
And then we think he brought the mortar and the straw to Jesus. Yeah. And Jesus is a real good brick maker. So he made good bricks for us, and now we're clothed with his good brick making.
Yeah.
Listen, man, God don't bring straw and mortar and mud to humans and say, make bricks. God sits down and makes the bricks. When God wanted a temple to dwell in, he didn't ask us to build it. Because he wanted to dwell in a body.
Yeah.
And so he came and made himself a temple. Right? And so we got this idea that there's times where God is Pharaoh telling us to make bricks. And if we can make bricks, then we'll be blessed. But if we can't make the bricks, we're going to be cursed. No. God come and said, listen, man, I'll make the bricks for you. Okay? So believe on me. He even made some bricks for us. See, I'm good at making bricks. So believe on me to make the bricks, and don't trust in your own works to make the bricks.
Right.
Because if you try to make the bricks yourself, you're going to bring the curse upon yourself. But if you rest in me to make the bricks for you, I'm going to raise you up glorified and immortal, and you'll have blessing in life all the days that you live. Right? God can't tell people to make bricks. He was never Pharaoh. He could never come in the likeness of Pharaoh. And I think I said this in the message, but James said, when those Jewish guys in his letter were experiencing hard times, he says, let no man say when he is tempted that he is tempted of God. For God tempteth no man with evil. You know what evil means? To be filled with laboring and toiling. To be filled with your own works to gain blessing in life. And so James says God can't tempt anybody to do that. But then we say in Deuteronomy, God come and told them they'd be blessed by their own works. So God was tempting them with evil.
Yeah. Doesn't
No.
make sense.
That ain't the thing, man.
Right.
No, God was trying to bring forth rest. Bring forth rest. Bring forth rest. Because there's a way that seems right unto a man, which is that we need to do. We need to do. But that way kills us.
Yes. Right. It does indeed. It does indeed.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Anybody have any thoughts? Anybody like to speak up online?
Wow.
Yeah, I know. Wow, I know.
My thought is, I'm sure glad somebody's recording this.
I was just, when you were talking about what you were just talking about. Today I looked up something in the dictionary. I said, how does a dictionary define what innocence is?
Mm.
And the way the Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines it is freedom from guilt or sin through being unacquainted with evil. This is an awesome definition.
Wow.
And then it says blamelessness.
Yeah.
And listen, that is God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He is unacquainted with evil.
Yeah.
So he's not going to put evil on somebody. He's not going to tempt anybody with evil. He is only good. And that's where the tree of the knowledge of good and evil came in, where we believed that we would be like God because we did know good and evil.
But
When
evil
there was no
was-
evil in God.
Yeah.
Now, evil exists, but when you're unacquainted with it, you're blameless.
Yeah. That's it.
Ah.
And it's beautiful what he just said, unacquainted with evil. You see, the serpent persuaded us that God was the cause of the evil in our life.
Right.
That's what he got us to think. That God was so dissatisfied with us that God was the cause of evil. But unacquainted with evil, that means God can't give a teaching about how you're going to have life through your own works.
He has no basis for this.
He doesn't know that teaching. He would be a liar. He would be lying. Nobody can have life by their own works.
Yeah.
No one. So how can God come and tell people they can? I hate to just destroy all the theology in the grace camp that's going around, but the blessing and curses of Deuteronomy are not according to the works of the law. It's according to faith.
Yeah.
And if you look throughout the whole Bible, it's consistent. Every time it talks about blessing and cursing, it talks about faith. What brought the curse on Adam?
You can believe.
He ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is what? By my works.
Yeah.
What God said? You're going to labor and toil all the days of your life. That's the cursed life.
Right.
He said, by the sweat of your brow, you're going to labor and toil all your days trying to bring forth good fruit And you're never going to bring forth good fruit. You're going to bring forth thorns and thistles. That's why after Adam tried to clothe himself, he still saw he was naked. He didn't bring forth any good fruit. That's the cursed life. And throughout the whole Bible, you find it repetitively being mentioned. Jeremiah, go read it, 17. You can see it in the first 5 verses there. He says what the blessing and the curse is. Mm-hmm. And then, man, when we finish up Deuteronomy 30, it's going to be so beautiful because Moses prophesied of God raising up a prophet after his likeness, and that prophet would come with the words, and that they should hearken unto him. And so at the end, Moses says, I set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Jesus came and did that same thing. Jesus came and did that same thing, except he didn't open his mouth when he said it. He was a prophet that spoke by what manifested in his flesh. Yeah. And so at the cross and the resurrection, Jesus set before us life and death, yes, blessing and cursing. Yes. The gospel is the declaration to choose life. And so, man, we're going to get to that and tie that all in, how Jesus did that. But, man, once you start seeing all this, you start seeing Jesus everywhere. Something beautiful happens to your life when Jesus becomes the meditation of your heart, where it's only Jesus, and it's what Jesus revealed, and Jesus rested, and the Father wouldn't suffer. When you start just meditating on that, man, it is like a tree of life inside of you. Yeah. And you're just like, and no matter how hot the sun can come, it can't cause you to wither, because you're planted next to the rivers of living water. Right? So the sun can shine real hot, boy, but your tree is like standing there. What? What?
I was just thinking about, oh, you have a Christian?
Yeah. Now how does it apply to when the Bible talks about our talents? You know, you're saying now we're to rest in God, but then he also talks about our talents and how we're to use our talents. And if we don't use our talents and produce fruits, that it'll die. So
yeah, I think you're quoting the parable of the talents, and that's not talking about our gifts. The parable of the talents is talking about how God gave the Jewish people the oracles of God to teach the whole world about his grace, and they weren't good stewards of the oracles of God, and so they squandered it away, is what that's talking about. That's why it's called a parable. So it's got nothing to do with our gifts. Now, with that being said, Paul does talk in several places about gifts of the Spirit, right? And he says a lot of different things about the gifts of the Spirit, and not just in the sense of words of wisdom or knowledge, but he says it in the sense of administration gifts, giving gifts, teaching gifts, prophet, all that. He talked about all those gifts. Now, all those gifts come forth in us when we rest in God, right? It's this. They're called grace gifts, right, or charis gifts, which means there's something God brings forth in people by the Spirit, right? So, yeah, we'll do that. So when we talk about resting, we're not talking about whether we do something or don't do something. We're talking about the foundation from which we do it, right? I preached for like an hour and 45 minutes without even taking a breath. I was resting. Do you see what I'm saying? So resting isn't we ain't going to do anything. It's that whatever we do, we're not doing it to be justified, right? So I'm not going to try to be justified by my preaching. I'm not going to be try to be justified by how many people I can get to agree with my teaching, or about how big we can build the church. But in resting in God for life, it's going to manifest the gifts he's put in me, right? Apart from my doing. And then I'm going to walk around doing it by passion. Right?
Yeah. I think the other thing that comes to mind is the fact that we do have gifts and talents, and we do have desires in our heart, passions, and you're now free to do them. As you rest in God, that gives you the freedom to be who you are, to do what causes you great joy and happiness, because God's placed those desires and those passions in your heart, and you've now kind of just cleared the way. I don't need to worry about what people are going to say, because who I am is good. I don't need to worry about, the fact that, I need to go get life on my own strength. I'm just going to enjoy being with God. I'm going to enjoy the fact that he gave me the desire to paint, or like my bride, he gave me the desire to do woodworking and to make fabulous kind of things in the garage. just go do it and do it with great joy.
Yeah.
That he's given you that passion, that desire, even that talent to do those things. So don't overthink it. Just go enjoy it.
Yeah. That's it. We don't want to hear about rest from the carnal mind.
No. Oh,
because listen, the first 5 years I was in grace, I thought about rest from the carnal mind and about how I'm going to make myself rest. Right? Well, when you think about resting from the carnal mind, then you hear, I'm not going to do anything at all.
Sleep all day.
Right?
That's right.
I'm going to sleep all day.
Yeah.
And so actual rest is talking about the condition of a person's heart. It's talking about the driving force behind what they do. It's not talking about whether they do or don't do. It's talking about the driving force behind their life. Jesus had people picking corn on the Sabbath.
They needed the corn.
Right? So, but do you see the position that his heart was in? It was of faith and not of sin.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it's talking about the driving force behind our life. Like when we first come and started the church, man, I really wanted to preach. I found this passion in my heart to tell people about God. But man, people get upset when I say this, but it's just how I think sometimes, or how I thought in the past. Man, I'm a horrible public speaker up on stage. That's just how I thought. And so I sat with this great desire to preach and tell people about God. But man, every time I got up on stage, I walked away thinking, oh my gosh, I was almost like Gideon, Moses. Can you send someone else to talk? Can I talk to them and then they go talk? And so what was going on at the beginning there is that brought me so much pain because I thought it was a word that I wasn't as I ought to be. Right? Now, resting was that I didn't look to that to justify me. I didn't look to how I thought I preached to justify me. And I didn't stop preaching in order to try to have peace.
Right.
I rested in God to bring me peace, and I kept doing what was in my heart.
Even though your soul
was
afflicted.
But if I wouldn't have been in God's rest, I would have stopped preaching, even though that's what I wanted to do. Yeah. Right? And so I wouldn't have been free to do what was in my heart to do, because I would have been trying to find life by my own works. But because I was resting in God to save my soul, I was set free to do what I wanted to do, even though every day I would hear these words talking about how bad I sucked, and how I should stop talking and everything else, and I probably had the loudest voice of everyone. It didn't really matter. What other people say can never affect you unless you already believe it yourself. Exactly. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
And so when people complained about how loud I was, or that I moved around too much, or whatever, it's not that they said that was the problem. Is that's what I believed.
Yeah, right.
And so they were just confirming it. Yeah, I never wanted to be up on stage talking. I hate public speaking, man.
Now we're gonna get some bright lights on.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Does that make some sense? Yeah.
Oh, good.
So there's a
question.
passion in your heart, and the power unto that passion manifesting is God. Now, as you rest in Him to be justified, instead of trying to be justified by your gifts, that gift is going to blossom more and more and more by His doing, and not your own. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Totally. All right. Anybody have anything?
I was thinking about what you said, the definition of innocence is.
Yeah.
And I had a couple thoughts that went along with that, because people are always, it seems for some reason, the judgment of God is always coming out in this video and that video, and someone asked me to watch another video, and it was about how it's about time the Christian church started preaching the Bible, and if they don't, God's judgment. And when I put that thought together with your thought about the definition of they don't match up, and what I saw for the first time was then God would be eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my gosh.
Well, that's what you said at the end of the service on Sunday, really.
Mm-hmm.
That same words. Yeah, that's all.
Really?
Amazing. Yeah.
I never got to the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's
That
too
was,
much in there.
Yeah.
No, it was amazing. It really was. And
Do you see how life and death was placed before Adam in the garden?
Yeah.
I could have gone and spent an hour connecting that.
Yeah, easily.
But this idea of life and death being placed before is not a new thing. And it's always the same thing that produces the life and the death. It didn't change. And so God set before Adam in the garden, right? Life and death, blessing and cursing. And then He exhorted him to choose life.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing. as what's happening there in Deuteronomy. You have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and you have the tree of life. And you have Moses telling the people that, man, if they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is by my works, I'm going to exalt myself, that tree will kill you. And you have the tree of life, which is God gives you life as a gift.
Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
Same thing.
What would you say to someone who says, but what about God's judgment?
What I would say,
Simplest way.
the simplest way to say it is that Jesus is God's judgment, and his judgment is unto life.
Yes.
Is what I would say. They don't understand the judgment of God. What I would say is they're looking on the judgment of a man and trying to displace that onto God. And I have a whole message about the real judgment of God. And there's a whole lot of people preaching it. It's just they don't like that judgment because they're busy living under judgment exalts itself above mercy. I guess they've never read the verse that says mercy exalts itself above judgment. Okay? And so they're filled with anger. And so they want people to be punished. Right? They're not filled with the mind of God.
Right.
And so they're trying to look on the judgment of God the way they would look on the judgment of an angry man sitting behind the bench. That's not God. God's judgment was issued in the resurrection.
Yes.
And what was his judgment? His judgment was against that which was killing people.
Right.
It wasn't against people.
Right.
And so God's judgment is against sin and death. It's against that which kills people. And the church more and more every day is hammering that. I hammer it every moment of every second of every day. And so I think that they need to get a revelation of what judgment is. And I think they need to get a revelation where Jesus in John chapter 6, 7, and 8 says the Father judges no man.
Yes.
And that the Father has given all judgment unto me. And I don't judge any man.
Yes.
Boom.
Is what he says.
Bernie has a clip on that where it says, when you stand judgment, there's a verdict.
Yeah.
And the verdict was against sin, and the verdict was death.
That's right.
The judgment is also for us.
Yeah, it's
Right?
it's in favor of us.
It's in favor of us, right? Because I've shared that a couple of times. That God's already made that judgment, and it's in favor of us. We're his sons and daughters in whom he is well pleased.
That's
And,
right.
and the resurrection is the
innocent.
witness to that.
Right. We're innocent of the accusation of the serpent, which is that we never come from God and that we're orphans. Right? That's why John 16, Jesus said, and when the Holy Spirit has come, he will convince the world again of sin because of unbelief, of righteousness because I go to the Father, of judgment because people are judged? No. Because the prince of this world is judged, is what he says. And so this is another great example, Numbers 11, where they put this, is it Numbers 11 or 21, where they put the brass serpent up on the pole?
Yeah, I know that, but I don't know.
That was the judgment of God. Now, what did he judge against?
The serpent.
Oh, you mean it wasn't people? So he judged against the serpent. That's the judgment of God. He judged the prince of this world. The prince of this world had bitten us, and the poison of asps had infected us, and we were dying. And so God judged against the serpent and the serpent's system of sin and death, so we could behold it. And all the people that could see that God judged against sin and death could be healed from the serpent's bite.
Life and death.
But what happens when people just continue to sin?
What do you mean what happens? They suffer at the hands of sin.
Because the wages of sin is death.
Okay, so they just don't you saying just die?
Well, yeah.
What will happen is when they meet God face to face, when
Well,
he comes
you
again.
got to qualify what that
Okay.
means. You know about people who believe on Jesus or not?
Yeah.
Okay, so if a person's believe on Jesus, John said they can't sin. Because the commandment of
I
God.
believe on Jesus.
Okay,
They
well,
say they do, but the actions are different.
okay, well, no. You don't judge a person by their fruit. Jesus said he judges no person after the flesh. He looks on the heart. Okay, so we're not going to look at people's actions and now judge whether they're a believer or not. Because Jesus said he doesn't judge like that. In fact, he said that's an unrighteous judgment. He said that's an unrighteous judgment. So John boiled all of the commandment down to this one thing. And he called it doing righteousness. We all think of doing righteousness as what we do outwardly.
Yeah, right.
But John come and said, he who has the Son can't sin. He wasn't saying that they might not never commit a sin. What he was saying there is that sin is found in whether you believed on the Son or not.
Right.
So if you believed on the Son, then you can't commit sin, right? Sin would be to reject the Son, okay? So if a person's believed on Jesus for eternal life, then they have life and they can't sin,
Yes.
right? If
Right.
they've rejected the testimony God's given in his Son, and they reject it all the way to the end, then they're going to perish.
So
Right?
The key is your understanding of what sin is. Sin is not behavior. Sin is belief. Either I mean, the definition is missing the mark. What are we missing the mark of? We're missing the mark of God's life for us. That's sin. And when the church today, the common understanding of sin is that it's a behavior and that it's a verb, but it isn't. It's a noun.
That's why Paul called it the works of the flesh.
Right.
In Galatians.
Yeah.
Right?
Good question.
Does that make sense?
Lisa, you okay with that? Okay.
So God wants us to live. He's given his judgment. His judgment is for us to have life.
Right.
He comes and tells us, you come for me. I'm your father. I love you. I'm the lover of your soul. I'm the lover of your life. I don't want you to perish with the death that's in the world. I'm going to preserve your life in me. Yeah. This thing over here, this tree of knowledge of good and evil, this serpent, this wisdom that says by your ability to bring forth good fruit, you'll be justified, that hasn't come from me, and it wants to kill you. That's his judgment. Right? Now, all those who hear it and believe it will have life. Those who reject it, they don't want life.
The simplicity and joy of the gospel.
But for me, and this is just me, I'm not going to quote a verse about this. I don't think anybody accidentally misses out on life. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Paul said that no one's going to have an excuse. What that means is no one's going to be like, oh, I didn't know.
Yeah. No one told me.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like
right.
everybody's going to have it real clear cut set out in front of them. Even if it's at the end, we're in the hospital bed and they're incoherent or whatever. In my mind, Jesus comes to everybody, even if it's that last moment, and comes and puts his hand out and says, I don't want you to die. Because in my mind, that's the height of your mortality staring you in the face.
Sure.
There's nothing that can convince you have life. Like when your mortality is staring you in the face, it's real obvious that you need life. And Jesus comes even in that moment.
Yeah.
I don't want you to perish. Take my hand.
You're saying something that's very, very important, and that's the fact that Jesus comes. That you don't need to have somebody there, to be the messenger, right? It may happen that someone is there sharing the gospel with you in that situation, but the fact that it's not our responsibility, it's God's responsibility to do that is a very comforting thought. Because Cindy and I shared the gospel with my dad on his deathbed. I don't know if we, the job we did was good or bad. I don't know. I think that he was okay in what he believed. But it's really comforting to know that even if we screwed it up, Jesus was right there taking good care of that.
Yeah.
And that's an awesome thing.
Yeah. Nobody's going to be like, whoops, I didn't know.
You should have told me.
I did the same thing with Sherry's dad. She was at school and they wouldn't let her out. And I was at the hospital when he passed, and I was crawled up in the bed and just told him about Jesus.
Yeah. All right, gang.
All right.
I love you guys.
With that, we're going to call it quits.
Night.
Have a great
Thanks,
evening.
everyone.
We love all you.
Is it too soon to do it this Friday? I think I can.
It's great seeing all those beautiful
It's up
faces.
to you.
Yeah.
I want to work around you.
No, well, I mean, we want to do it sooner rather than
Bye. Bye. Love you guys.
It's up to you. I'm not like stressed out about it.
1, 2, 3.